When a young woman named Emma lands in bustling Hanoi, she believes she's merely following an inexplicable urge to walk the same streets her father once did, decades ago. She wanders through dense crowds and winding alleys without fully understanding what she seeks. The moment she steps into a dimly lit antique shop, though, a single photograph changes everything, hurtling her into a mystery she never expected to unravel. Before we dive into this emotional odyssey of lost love, hidden heritage, and the power of family ties, let us know where you're reading from. If you believe in hope's ability to heal even the deepest wounds, give this story a like and subscribe for more. She arrived in Vietnam with a quiet sense of anticipation woven into every step. Although Emma Fletcher was not the impulsive type, she had listened to a small voice urging her to see the country her father rarely spoke about. Ever since she was a child, she had held images of him as a serious, introspective man. He was prone to long silences on nights when certain memories, or regrets, gnawed at him. Emma never fully understood that side of him, the part haunted by a war he'd once fought and a life he'd left behind. Now, she found herself alone among the crowded streets of Hanoi, keenly aware that this was more than a trip. This was the key to understanding everything she had never known about the man who raised her. It was late afternoon when she first wandered into the antique shop. The sun hovered just over the skyline, painting the street in warm gold, while the inside of the shop was dim and musty, filled with odd relics nobody had bothered to dust in ages. She browsed out of curiosity at first, old pottery, chipped vases, rusted metals, tattered photographs. Then her gaze snagged on one snapshot hidden behind a stack of worn postcards. She instinctively reached for it, drawn by some ineffable pull. As she lifted it into the light, her breath caught in her throat. She recognized Jim, her father, standing beside a battered Jeep, looking youthful and hopeful, his eyes betraying a subtle uncertainty. Emma's hand trembled. She purchased the photo immediately, ignoring the bemused look from the shopkeeper who likely wondered why anyone would pay good money for a faded relic. She managed to sputter a few questions, desperately trying to figure out where it had come from. The shopkeeper, an elderly Vietnamese woman with kind eyes, spoke softly about an aging American veteran who sometimes sold items from his personal collection. He had insisted these pieces be preserved, she said, though he never parted easily with photos that bore meaning. The woman offered no more details than that, only that he lived somewhere on the outskirts of Hanoi. Emma pressed gently, curiosity blazing, but the shopkeeper could give no precise address. She merely shrugged, suggesting that the man might be found near a food stall or in the company of other veterans who gathered occasionally. Emma left the shop with her emotions swirling. She'd come to Vietnam on a whim, driven by a compulsion to stand on the same earth her father once trod. But this photo changed the nature of her pilgrimage. That night, Emma barely slept. She lay on the bed in her modest guest house, hearing the city's nighttime hum, thinking about her father's stoic face in that photograph. It was probably taken in the late 60s or early 70s, judging by his appearance and the context she knew from family lore. He had been deployed to Vietnam during the war. Emma felt an ache of longing to piece together the unspoken chapters in her father's life. The next morning, she rose early. The sun was still shy on the horizon, and the streets were only just coming to life. Mopeds whined past her, carrying people to jobs and markets. Sidewalk vendors sold steaming bowls of pho, and the scent of broth, herbs, and spices mingled with the motor fumes in the thick, warm air. She asked around, anyone who seemed old enough to recall the war era, anyone who might know an American veteran living in Hanoi. The language barrier was significant, but she found a couple of bilingual locals. One directed her to a market near Long Bien Bridge where foreign veterans occasionally gathered to meet, reminisce, and drink strong local coffee. Emma hopped into a taxi, heart pounding, uncertain of what she might find. She wandered the market, scanning faces, searching for a figure who might match the vague description the shopkeeper had given. An older man, tall, still upright despite his years, often wearing a faded cap. Hours dragged by, and she saw no one who resembled such a figure. At midday, she found herself at a small cafe, eyes drifting over the passers-by as she sipped iced tea. her mind filled with questions. Why had her father never told her about any personal artifacts left in Vietnam? Why had he never mentioned a photograph? Eventually, her persistence paid off when an elderly Vietnamese man overheard her inquiries and mentioned that an American named Tom was known to frequent an open-air eatery near West Lake on Wednesday mornings. Emma thanked him profusely and jotted down the directions. An inexplicable sense of destiny spurred her on, as though something invisible guided her footsteps. Over the next few days, she explored more of Hanoi's winding streets, soaking in the atmosphere. She marveled at the French colonial architecture, the many lakes and temples hidden among modern chaos, and the blending of old and new. Every sight, every sound, felt like a clue in a scavenger hunt for her father's past. Yet she was never certain if she was chasing a phantom or if these bits of information would lead her to something tangible. Wednesday morning arrived with a dazzling sunrise that cast orange and pink streaks across the sky. Emma made her way to the eatery near West Lake. She felt half nervous, half elated, as though on the brink of a life-changing discovery. She scanned the patrons. A few locals hunched over plates of rice and fish, a couple of tourists sipping coffee, and then she spotted him. A tall, gaunt American with white hair, wearing a camouflage cap reminiscent of an army style. He looked to be in his 70s, perhaps older. Emma's pulse kicked up. She took a moment to gather her courage before approaching. He was hunched over a bowl of soup, stirring slowly, as though lost in thought. Emma approached his table and offered a shy greeting. The man frowned warily but gestured for her to sit. She introduced herself, explaining in halting words that she had come across a photograph of her father in a local antique shop. The mention of the photo made the man's eyes narrow with guarded curiosity. "Your father served here, you say?" he asked, his English tinged with a slight accent that wasn't purely American, as if his years in Vietnam had shaped his speech. Emma nodded, pulling the photograph out of her bag. She carefully placed it on the table, watching the old man's reaction. His gaze lingered on the image for a long moment. He set down his spoon and traced the outline of Jim's face. "I remember him," he said, voice trembling just slightly. Emma felt a surge of hope that threatened to make her cry. She asked for details, but he remained silent at first, perhaps wrestling with the ghosts of decades past. Finally, he introduced himself as Tom Whitaker, a retired soldier who had chosen to stay in Vietnam after the war. He spoke of regrets, of living with choices he couldn't undo. He admitted to having collected photographs, letters, trinkets from those turbulent years, items left behind by fellow GIs who had tried to bury their experiences after returning home. Jim's photograph, he confessed, was one of the last pieces he parted with. He had sold it only because he needed money for medical bills. Eager to learn more, Emma pressed him gently. At first, Tom seemed reluctant, suspicious that she might be chasing a sensational story or seeking to dredge up painful war memories. But as Emma opened up about how her father had passed away some years ago without ever truly talking about Vietnam, Tom's demeanor softened. He saw a genuine longing in her to connect with her father's life. Slowly, piece by piece, he agreed to share what he knew, though he warned her that the story was heavy with heartbreak. They arranged to meet later that afternoon at Tom's humble dwelling outside the city. Emma arrived in a small taxi, traveling along dusty roads that meandered past rice fields and clusters of homes. The air smelled of greenery and the distant promise of rain. Tom's house was modest, barely more than a few rooms, but it radiated a strange warmth that seemed to stem from Tom's devotion to old memories. He led Emma to a cluttered sitting area where, stacked in corners and stuffed into shelves, were boxes of letters, photographs, medals, and journals from the war era. He offered her tea, and when they settled, he began, "Your father was a good man, but he carried a great burden. I don't know all the details, only what I witnessed and what he confided to me, piece by piece. He fell in love here, with a local woman named Lynn. It wasn't uncommon, for soldiers to find solace in relationships during that time, but for Jim it was more. He was prepared to stay, to do right by her. But the war ended, his unit shipped out, and there was so much red tape. He fought like hell to come back, but life, guilt, Everything got in the way. Tom's voice shook slightly as he spoke, betraying the rawness of old scars. Emma listened intently, heart pounding. Her father had always been a reserved man. Emma had never known him to be especially romantic, and the thought of him deeply in love, to the point of wanting to remain in Vietnam, was almost unfathomable. As Tom recounted the frustration Jim faced with bureaucracy, applications for re-entry, lost letters, changed addresses, Emma's eyes stung with unshed tears. A picture emerged of a man paralyzed between two worlds. He left Vietnam, forced by circumstances, but never truly escaped the heartbreak of leaving someone behind. According to Tom, Jim had confided in him sporadically, sometimes in letters, sometimes in rare visits back to Southeast Asia. But each time, Jim's attempts to locate Lynn had failed. The country was in upheaval. Addresses vanished, and contact networks broke down. Eventually, Jim surrendered to despair and carried that invisible weight home. For Emma, this explained so much. His haunted eyes whenever news of Vietnam flickered on television, his long silences when asked about his time as a soldier, the endless nights he spent on the porch, nursing a beer and gazing at the stars. She felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. She finally had a partial reason for the hollowness she had sensed in him. Yet she yearned for more details. Tom admitted that he, too, had lost contact with Lynn. He only knew that she'd struggled after Jim departed, that she was pregnant with Jim's child. Emma gasped. The notion that she might have a half-sibling somewhere in Vietnam felt both terrifying and electrifying. She pressed Tom for more, but the old soldier clammed up, as if certain lines of memory were too painful or too private. It was only after some coaxing that he revealed one final piece of knowledge. He'd heard rumors Lynn had given birth to a baby boy named Min. Over the decades, nobody knew what became of him, especially once Lynn disappeared from the usual circles. Some said she died, some said she moved to a distant province. There were countless stories, none confirmed. At this, Emma felt a storm of emotions. If her father had a child in Vietnam, that meant Emma had a brother she'd never met. The realization was overwhelming. She convinced Tom to see if he could recall any further details, any clue that might lead to Min's whereabouts. Reluctantly, Tom rummaged through his old letters and notebooks. Hours stretched as Emma leafed through pages of barely legible scrawl and faded Polaroids. By evening's approach, her eyes were red from reading. Finally, near the bottom of a dusty box, she found a note referencing an orphanage in Hanoi, dated roughly a year after the war ended. Tom recognized the name, a small, modest place known to have taken in many war orphans. The note suggested that Lynn may have been forced by dire circumstances to leave Min there. Emma's stomach churned at the thought of a mother torn by poverty, war, and heartbreak, leaving her child in hopes he might have a better life. Armed with that fragile lead, Emma returned to her guest house, mind reeling. She flicked on the air conditioner to combat the humid evening but couldn't find relief from the swirl of emotions. Lying awake, she stared at the photograph of her father again. She now understood the sorrow behind that faint smile. It was a young man's face, already etched with the knowledge that happiness was fleeting. Emma resolved not to let this remain an unfinished story. She would find answers, for her father's sake, for Lynn's sake, for Min's sake, and for her own. The next morning, after restless sleep, she traveled to that orphanage. Although many years had passed, she clung to the hope that some record might exist. The building's facade was faded, its walls chipped, the courtyard silent. An elderly nun greeted her, politely explaining that the orphanage had changed hands multiple times, and many files from the war era were incomplete, if they existed at all. Emma felt her resolve waver, but she refused to give up. She wandered through battered filing cabinets stacked in a dusty back room. Time had yellowed the papers, the writing smudged or sometimes water-damaged. She inched through each drawer, sifting birth dates, adoption ledgers, anything that might mention a boy named Min. The hours crept by. Her knees cramped, her fingertips blackened with dust, but she pressed on. Late in the afternoon, a small ledger caught her eye, labeled 1976 to 1978. Heart pounding, she flipped through. Names and partial notes littered the pages. Many entries were incomplete. Then she spotted a line, Min mother's name Lin father unknown, turned over to orphanage 1976, adoption in 1977 by American family, new name not listed. Emma froze. She reread it 3 times. It was the clearest confirmation that Min had indeed existed, that Lin had left him here, and that he was later adopted by Americans. Her heart sank at the revelation. If Min had been taken to the United States, that meant he could be anywhere. He might not even be aware of his heritage. He might have grown up believing entirely different stories about his origins. He could have a new name, a new history. Emma gathered what documents she could. The nun apologized that many details, including the adoptive parents' information, had been lost. In the chaos following the war, paperwork was often haphazard. Nonetheless, Emma felt an electric jolt of hope. Min was out there, likely living in America. She needed to find him, to tell him who his father was and how fiercely he had tried to return. She left the orphanage with shaky legs. Outside, the sun was low, painting the sky with pink and purple. It was beautiful, but Emma's thoughts were far from tranquil. She pictured a child, alone and perhaps bewildered, leaving Vietnam for a strange new land. She imagined all the possible futures he might have had. She thought of her father's face once more, and her chest tightened. Emma returned to Tom's place, showing him the orphanage records. He nodded, a mixture of relief and sadness crossing his features. "I always suspected that might have happened," he said. "War left many children in limbo. Some were lucky enough to be adopted." Emma asked him if he knew anything else, but he shook his head. "No, I lost track. Once Jim left, once I had my own troubles, I hardly kept up with anyone. I've carried guilt about it." Emma told him not to blame himself, that life had a way of splintering people's paths, especially in times of conflict. She could see the toll that guilt had taken on Tom. In a way, she recognized a kindred spirit in him, both of them haunted by what they hadn't done or couldn't change. In her final days in Vietnam, Emma prepared for the next stage. Returning to the U.S. to begin a search for Min, she promised Tom she would keep him updated. The old soldier gave her a firm handshake, then pulled her into a gentle hug. "Your father was a friend. I'm sorry I couldn't do more, but I'm glad you came." Emma left him with gratitude in her heart. She spent her last evening in Hanoi walking aimlessly by the lake in the center of the city. Lanterns glowed on the water surface, and the hum of motorbikes provided a soundtrack to the city's nightlife. She felt a twinge of sorrow, knowing she was leaving with more questions, but also a sense of purpose that burned brighter than ever. She pictured that line in the orphanage ledger, adopted by American family. It was a small thread, but it was enough. She was determined to follow it. Back home in the States, her first few weeks were a blur of phone calls and emails to adoption agencies, genealogical services, and governmental offices. Bureaucratic dead ends loomed. Decades-old adoption records were often sealed or incomplete, and privacy laws made it nearly impossible for a non-biological relative to access them. Emma became adept at navigating labyrinthine processes, sending meticulously crafted letters, collecting every piece of identification and proof of her father's involvement in the war. Some offices responded kindly, others brushed her off with form letters. She persevered, fueled by the memory of Jim's photograph and the faint mention in the orphanage book. Meanwhile, her personal life began to strain under the weight of this quest. She had a modest job as a freelance journalist, but her assignments suffered as she poured more time into searching for Min. Friends invited her out to social gatherings, but she declined, too preoccupied. Days blurred into nights. She lost track of how many phone calls she made, how many times she repeated the same story. "I believe my father left a child in Vietnam. The child was adopted by an American family, and I'm trying to find him. His birth name was Min, the mother was Lin." Frustration built. She had thought the hardest part would be tracking leads in Vietnam, but the bureaucratic maze in her own country proved equally formidable. She confronted repeated questions of legal standing. "Are you sure you're related? Do you have any documents stating your father recognized paternity?" The intangible heartbreak of war had left little official proof. Emma's only recourse was her father's personal letters, what few she possessed, and the orphanage entry. Those were enough to hint at the truth, but not enough to satisfy government agencies. At her lowest points, Emma wondered if she should accept the unknown as part of her father's story. She questioned whether she had the right to uproot Min's life, possibly shattering his sense of identity. Yet every time the doubt crept in, she remembered Jim's distant eyes, the intangible loneliness she'd felt in him. She remembered how she had grown up feeling that her father was fighting unseen battles. She wanted to bring closure not just for him, but for Min, who had the right to know who he was and how he came to be adopted. After countless efforts, a small breakthrough emerged in the form of an old social worker. She phoned Emma after receiving one of her many letters. The social worker had vague recollections of an adoption from Vietnam around 1977, involving a baby whose name might have been spelled differently. Perhaps Min or Min. She mentioned that the adopting parents lived in California at the time. Emma latched onto that detail as though it were a life raft in a stormy sea. She poured her energy into researching adoption agencies that had operated in California during that period. This led her to a handful of possibilities. Encouraged but still facing walls of red tape, Emma decided to get more creative. She posted on social media, genealogical forums, war veteran message boards. She asked if anyone knew of a Vietnamese adoptee named Min or Min, adopted around 1977, father likely an American soldier named Jim. Many responses were unhelpful. Some were well-meaning but unrelated. Yet a handful of people reached out with tips. One suggested she check the records of Catholic charities that facilitated adoptions after the war. Another pointed her toward a historical society that archived refugee and adoptee stories from Vietnam. Piece by piece, Emma gathered details, cross-checking every possible lead. Months passed. Her finances dwindled from the cost of traveling to archives, paying for research and taking time off work. She parted ways with her regular journalism gigs. Friends expressed concern that she was lost in a never-ending quest. But Emma's determination refused to wane. She felt an almost spiritual calling to follow through. If she gave up, she would be betraying Jim's memory, leaving Min adrift in a truth he never knew. The stakes were too high. One chilly evening, as autumn leaves blanketed her small Midwestern town, Emma received an email from a genealogical investigator. She had hired this woman a few weeks earlier, a last-ditch attempt to find official documents. The email's subject line read, "Possible match found." Emma's hands shook as she opened it. The investigator explained that she had cross-referenced data from various adoption records and found a probable candidate. A man named Michael Lawson, born around 1976 in Hanoi, brought to the U.S. in 1977, adopted by a couple from California. The woman could not confirm all details, but the timeline and place of birth aligned. Emma's heart nearly soared out of her chest. She whispered to the photograph of Jim on her desk, "I think I found him, Dad." Further research verified that Michael Lawson lived in a modest, rural area of Oregon. He was in his 40s, employed in carpentry, and had no known ties to his birth family. Emma froze at the enormity of what she was about to do. Contact him out of the blue and announce that she was his half-sister. She spent sleepless nights drafting letters and emails, only to delete or tear them up, paralyzed by fear of how he might react. Eventually, she settled on writing him a heartfelt letter, explaining the situation as gently as possible, enclosing a copy of the orphanage record and a photograph of Jim. She ended with an invitation. "If you want to talk, here's my number. If not, I'll respect your decision." She mailed the letter, then entered a painful waiting game. Each day felt like a year. She tried to immerse herself in everyday tasks. Grocery runs, tidying her small apartment, calling old friends. But her mind was always half consumed by thoughts of Michael. She pictured 100 different scenarios. Maybe he'd be ecstatic, or maybe he'd dismiss her as a fraud. Weeks crawled by. No reply. Emma grew despondent, doubting the correctness of her approach. Then, on a rainy afternoon, her phone buzzed with an unknown number. She answered, voice quivering. A man's voice greeted her, tentative but polite. "This is Michael Lawson. I got your letter." Emma's heart hammered. She tried to stay calm, but she felt tears well up just hearing his voice. He sounded uncertain, maybe even scared. She understood. It must have been a shock to receive a letter claiming he had a whole unknown past. She explained everything again, more slowly, answering his questions about Jim, about how she found him, about the orphanage record. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I don't even know who I am anymore." She gently reminded him that he was still the same person, that his past hadn't changed who he became. But she also acknowledged the emotional impact of discovering that his father might have been an American GI who never had the chance to return for him. They spoke for nearly an hour, swirling around the edges of the story, both aware that they were strangers yet tied by blood. Before they ended the call, he asked if they could meet. Emma's breath caught. She said yes, she would travel to Oregon anytime. They agreed to set a date. She arrived in a small Oregon town some weeks later, the hills shrouded in mist, tall pines lining the roads. She stayed in a modest motel, anxiety building as she prepared to see Michael in person. That next morning they met at a cafe. She spotted him from a distance. He stood around 5'9", with a sturdy build, dark hair lightly salted with gray. He looked more nervous than she felt, shifting his weight from one foot to another. Emma walked up, unsure whether to offer a hug or a handshake. She ended up giving him a small, awkward wave. They settled into a booth. He sipped black coffee, gaze shifting uneasily. Emma tried to read his features, searching for any resemblance to Jim. She found small hints, perhaps in the shape of his jaw, the set of his brow. He asked her to tell him everything she knew, no matter how painful. So she began from the start, traveling to Vietnam, finding the photograph, meeting Tom, discovering Lynn's story, unearthing the orphanage records. She spoke of Jim's heartbreak, his repeated attempts to return, how he carried guilt all his life. She also told Michael about Jim as she knew him personally. His gentle spirit, his love for quiet evenings, his hobby of restoring old cars. Michael listened with deep intensity, not interrupting. His eyes misted over when Emma described how Jim never found closure, how he had passed away regretful and torn by the memory of a love left behind. Then Michael asked the big question, why didn't he try harder? Emma sensed his pain. She gently explained that he did, according to Tom's accounts, but the labyrinth of post-war politics, bureaucracy, and personal struggles defeated him. Michael's face hardened, a protective mask forming. "He was my father," he said quietly, "but he never raised me. I grew up without knowing anything about him. I'm trying not to hate him for that." Emma swallowed, feeling the weight of his words. She told him that Jim carried that burden, too, that he was never truly whole after losing his chance to be there for Min, or Michael as he was now known. They parted that day with no dramatic tears or embraces, but there was a tentative sense of connection. Over the following weeks, they stayed in touch. Sometimes Michael called Emma late at night, grappling with questions of identity. Why do I look the way I do? Did Jim have the same laugh? Did he have any siblings? She answered as best she could. Other times, he wrestled with anger or grief, lamenting that fate had stolen any chance for him to know his father personally. Emma listened, empathized, and also shared her own childhood memories. They found themselves forging a bond over the father neither had truly understood. Eventually, Michael expressed a desire to see Vietnam for himself. He wanted to walk the streets, to feel the place where he was born, to reconnect with those earliest roots. Emma offered to accompany him, relieved that he was willing to explore this shared inheritance rather than shut it away. They arranged the trip for the end of the summer, giving him time to wrap up his work commitments, and giving Emma time to plan an itinerary that would revisit the places she had discovered on her first journey. When the day arrived, they flew together into Hanoi under a blazing sun. The airport's chaos overwhelmed Michael, who had never traveled outside the U.S. before. Emma guided him through the swirling crowds, reassuring him as best she could. Once they were settled in a small hotel, Michael sat on the edge of his bed and stared at the foreign world outside the window. Brightly colored signs, the honking of scooters, the swirl of languages. Emma saw in his eyes the same mixture of wonder and trepidation she had felt on her first visit. Their first mission was to locate Tom. They found him in the same neighborhood near Westlake, seated at a plastic table on the sidewalk, sipping tea. His eyes widened at the sight of Michael. Emma introduced them, explaining that this was Jim's son. The baby once known as Min. Tom's face flashed with recognition and a pang of remorse. He shook Michael's hand gently, offering a broken apology for not having done more decades ago. Michael, still overwhelmed, barely managed a nod. There was no easy way to reconcile years of what-ifs in a single handshake. They sat together, sifting through memories and regrets. Tom showed Michael the old letters from Jim, the same ones Emma had pored over. Michael read them hungrily, absorbing his father's words, many filled with longing and a frustrated desperation to return to Vietnam. Some lines made him cry. Others sparked a flicker of anger at the system that prevented Jim from reuniting with Lynn and the child he never got to meet. Tom told him stories of Jim's sense of humor, his bravery under fire, and his intense loyalty. It was a bittersweet revelation for Michael, learning these facets of a man he had no chance to know in life. After this emotional meeting, Emma and Michael ventured back to the orphanage, now even more dilapidated than before. The elderly nun who had helped Emma was still there, greeting them with gentle compassion. Michael walked those hallways, pressing a hand against the faded walls. He tried to picture himself as an infant in this place, though he had no memory of it. A wave of deep sadness washed over him. Emma stood close by, offering silent support. The nun rummaged through the same dusty cabinets, producing the same ledger entry that named Lynn as the birth mother. Michael's eyes traced each letter, as if seeing proof that he truly was from here. He stood quietly afterward, his shoulders trembling. Emma stepped beside him, setting a comforting hand on his back. They spent the next few days exploring Hanoi. Michael was fascinated by the old quarter, the blend of French colonial and Vietnamese architecture, the swirl of street stalls selling everything from fruit to souvenirs. He was also deeply moved by the war memorials, seeing pictures and artifacts that offered a stark reminder of the conflict that shaped his fate before he was even old enough to speak. One afternoon, they ventured out to see the remnants of an old airfield used by American forces, now largely reclaimed by the city's growth. Michael found himself imagining Jim as a young soldier, stepping onto these runways, heart full of hopes and fears. It was almost surreal, bridging the gap between father and son through the same soil. A highlight of their trip was a journey south to an area where Jim's unit had once been stationed. They rented a car, heading into the countryside, passing rice paddies and small villages. Children waved at them as they drove by. The scenery was breathtaking, lush greenery, winding rivers, distant hills. Emma and Michael found a battered old memorial that listed American units deployed there during the war. They stood side by side, reading the names. Michael ran his fingers over the letters, searching for mention of Jim's unit. Felt like paying homage to a ghost. Neither spoke much, but they both felt a sense of closeness to Jim in that moment, as though he was walking with them. On the return trip, they stopped to see Tom one more time. He had tears in his eyes when he saw Michael again. "I wish I could tell Jim how you turned out," he said, voice quavering. "I think he would be proud." Michael swallowed hard, struggling to speak. He eventually managed a quiet, "Thank you." They spent hours talking about the intricacies of that era. How many soldiers came to Vietnam, lost parts of themselves, and never recovered. Tom offered new insights about Lynn's struggles, how she'd been scorned by some for fraternizing with an American, how she faced poverty and stigma. It was heartbreak layered on heartbreak. Michael listened, absorbing the pain that had shaped his origins. He found himself grieving for a mother he never knew and for a father who was kept away. As their time in Vietnam wound down, Emma and Michael visited one final spot, the place where Emma had first found Jim's photograph. The antique shop was still there, musty and dim. The shopkeeper recognized Emma, greeting her with a gentle smile. Michael wandered among dusty relics, marveling at the notion that a single photograph here had sparked a chain of events that changed his entire understanding of who he was. Emma felt an echo of that initial shock when she'd first laid eyes on Jim's young face. After they emerged from the shop, Michael gazed at the bustling street. "I feel him here," he said, voice low but steady. Emma understood. She too had sensed that intangible presence, as though every corner of the city whispered pieces of Jim's story. She nodded, tears brimming at the edges of her eyes, grateful that her brother, this stranger who was no stranger, had also found a place in his heart for the father they shared. They flew back to the U.S. with hearts heavier yet somehow more at peace. Together, they navigated the next phase, explaining everything to Michael's adoptive parents, who received the news with mixed emotions. They had known bits of his background, but not the specifics. They welcomed Emma with caution but also empathy, recognizing that their son had just discovered a missing chapter of his life. Over the following months, Emma and Michael stayed in close contact, forging a sibling bond that was both raw and beautiful. They visited each other's homes, met each other's friends. Emma wrote a lengthy journal capturing every detail she'd learned about Jim, so that Michael could have a written record of his father's life. One day, Michael expressed a desire to hold a small memorial for Jim, a gesture of gratitude for the man who, despite fate, had given him life. Emma wholeheartedly agreed. They chose a quiet spot in Oregon, near a river that reminded them both of Vietnam's waterways. They invited a few of Michael's friends, Emma's mother, and a couple of Emma's close confidants. Together, they read excerpts from Jim's letters, played soft music, and shared stories of the father they knew and the father they discovered. Though tears flowed, the ceremony was imbued with hope, a recognition that something lost had been, in part, reclaimed. Emma pictured Jim smiling down, freed from regrets that had haunted him. As time passed, word of Emma's search and reunion spread. A local news outlet interviewed them about their extraordinary story of bridging continents and decades to reunite a fractured family. Emma agreed to do the interview only because she believed it might help other adoptees or veterans' families seeking closure. In the piece, Michael spoke openly of his conflicted feelings: anger at being left, tempered by compassion for a man torn by war. Emma spoke of her father's unwavering love, even if circumstances barred him from fulfilling it. The story struck a chord in the community, prompting others to reach out with similar tales of lost relatives, hidden legacies, heartbreak in the aftermath of conflict. In the midst of these connections, Emma found a new calling. She began using her journalistic background to assist other families searching for missing relatives, writing articles highlighting the complexities of wartime separations and adoptions. She collaborated with nonprofits and adoption advocates. The heartbreak that had once haunted her father became a catalyst for healing others. Michael, too, found a renewed sense of purpose. He started volunteering with an organization that helped foreign adoptees trace their birth roots, offering empathy and solidarity. The two siblings discovered that the darkness of the past could transform into a guiding light for others. They still had moments of bitterness, nights when they wondered how life might have been different if Jim had succeeded in bringing Lynn and Min to America all those years ago. But they also learned the power of forgiveness, of understanding that sometimes even love is not enough to overcome the bureaucracies and tragedies of war. They forgave Jim for not moving mountains, and they forgave themselves for not knowing sooner. In that process, they found acceptance. Their final trip back to Vietnam happened almost a year later. Emma and Michael invited Tom to join them on a small pilgrimage. He was old and frail but insisted on coming, wanting to see them complete what he called Jim's journey. They traveled to the countryside where Lynn had once lived, even though no one expected to find her. They found an overgrown plot of land that locals said once belonged to her family. Michael knelt and touched the soil, paying silent respect to the mother who had made the ultimate sacrifice by giving him up so he could have a better life. He whispered thanks, tears slipping down his cheeks. The moment was profoundly private, shared by Emma and Tom standing respectfully behind him. As they returned to the city, they visited a humble shrine, lighting incense for Jim, for Lynn, for all the people lost in the chaos of war. Tom placed a trembling hand on Michael's shoulder, murmuring that Jim would be at peace now, knowing his son had grown into a compassionate, thoughtful man who had traveled across the world to honor the family's legacy. Michael nodded, expression solemn. Emma slipped her arm through Michael's, feeling the warmth of a bond forged through heartbreak, love, and perseverance. Evenings in Hanoi were filled with reflection and quiet camaraderie. They would sit by the lake, sharing stories, letting the city's life wash over them. Sometimes, passers-by would notice the elderly American with two younger Americans by his side, all three looking as though they belonged yet were also outsiders. A few times, Vietnamese veterans greeted Tom with polite nods, acknowledging an odd kinship formed in the aftermath of war. Emma found the entire city humming with a sense of closure, as though the last chapter of Jim's story was finally being written in the place it started. On their final day, Emma and Michael walked alone through the old quarter, weaving among vendors selling painted fans, wooden carvings, and embroidered fabrics. Michael paused at a stall displaying photographs of old Hanoi. He picked one up, an image of the Long Bien Bridge in the 1970s. "This place must have looked so different back then," he said softly. "And Dad was here, living a life we knew nothing about." Emma squeezed his hand. "But now we know. Now his story is part of ours." They left the stall and headed toward the water, letting the city's bustle fade into a background hum. That evening, they stood at the edge of the Red River, a warm breeze drifting across the murky waters. Emma handed Michael a small framed picture of Jim, the very one she had first found in the antique shop. Michael held it gently, as if afraid to disturb the memory it represented. Together, they placed a floating lantern on the river, letting it drift away with the current. It glowed faintly in the gathering dusk, a symbolic gesture of love and remembrance. The siblings stood side by side, each lost in their thoughts. Emma closed her eyes and saw Jim, young and hopeful, smiling through the faded photograph, proud that his children had found each other. Michael exhaled slowly, releasing some last bit of tension. They watched until the lantern's light was just a speck, then vanished entirely. Back in the States, Emma and Michael returned to their respective routines, but everything felt subtly transformed. Emma continued her new role as a resource for others searching for war-displaced relatives. She wrote articles, gave interviews, and sometimes traveled to speak at small gatherings. Her writing gained depth and empathy, infused with her personal journey. Michael found that, while the revelation of his origins had shaken him, it also anchored him in a new sense of identity. He no longer felt the vague void that had nagged at him all his life. He carried Jim's photograph in his wallet, a quiet reminder of who he was and where he came from. When he worked in his carpentry shop, shaping wood into something useful and strong, he imagined that some of Jim's creativity and determination flowed through his own hands. Their last major step was to gather their families, Emma's mother, Michael's adoptive parents, and a few close friends, for a modest dinner. They told stories about Vietnam, shared pictures of their travels, and toasted to Jim's memory. There were tears, laughter, and a sense of awe at how life's paths could curve and intersect in the most unexpected ways. Emma's mother confessed that she'd known Jim carried a heavy regret, but she never imagined it was this profound. Michael's adoptive parents admitted they had little idea of the heartbreak behind his history. They had only known that he came from a war-torn country. The dinner ended with a group hug, bridging two families that had once been worlds apart. In private moments, Emma sometimes wondered if Lynn was still alive, living somewhere in Vietnam under a different name or perhaps having passed on. She felt pangs of sorrow for a woman who had been forced to make an unbearable choice. Yet she hoped that, in some cosmic sense, Lynn too found peace, knowing her son grew up to be a kind man, loved by a family that cherished him. Whenever Emma felt that ache, she recalled the final image of Michael kneeling on the land that once belonged to Lynn's family, offering silent thanks. It felt like the full circle of a journey begun decades ago. Years later, Emma continued to maintain close ties with Michael. They visited each other frequently, called often, and even spent holidays together. She watched as Michael formed a deeper relationship with her extended relatives, who welcomed him wholeheartedly once the shock wore off. He became, in many ways, a missing puzzle piece that completed the portrait of Jim's legacy. She, in turn, became a sister he never knew he needed, a witness to their father's love and a partner in searching for the truths that lay buried. When the anniversary of Jim's passing arrived, Emma and Michael met at a quiet cemetery where Jim's ashes had been interred. They brought flowers and placed a small Vietnamese flag beside them, a symbolic acknowledgement of the land that shaped his fate. The day was bright, with a crisp breeze that rustled the branches overhead. They stood in silence for a while, each lost in reflections. Then Michael knelt, placing a hand on the plaque bearing Jim's name. "Thank you," he whispered, voice trembling. Emma closed her eyes, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not just for the man who had given her life but also for the strange series of events that brought them to this moment. In that space of gentle stillness, Emma recognized the deeper meaning of everything they had endured. Love transcended borders, wars, and decades. Family bonds could be hidden, tested by time and conflict, yet still endure. The journey they had undertaken to find Min, now Michael, wasn't simply about discovering a missing sibling. It was about illuminating the depth of Jim's heart. He had been flawed, shaped by forces beyond his control, and tormented by guilt. But his love had persisted, echoing through the photograph, through Tom's recollections, through the orphanage records, leading Emma and Michael to each other. By the time they left the cemetery, Emma felt a serene calm settle over her. There was still sorrow for what might have been, but no bitterness. She glanced at Michael, who seemed equally reflective. He caught her eye and offered a small, lopsided smile that radiated both acceptance and hope. They walked out into the day, the sun warm on their faces, united by the invisible threads of a family once torn apart. Across the world, in the labyrinth of memories that comprised Vietnam, life carried on. The antique shop might still hold dusty relics for curious visitors. Tom might sit by Westlake reflecting on friendships past and present. The orphanage might continue its mission under new hands. But for Emma and Michael, that chapter had come full circle. They carried Vietnam within them now, as well as the spirit of a father and mother who, despite tragedy, had given them the profound gift of a shared bond. And in that bond, they found redemption, healing, and a story that would guide them for the rest of their lives. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like if you haven't already, and subscribe for more.